right. Okay, well, thanks for joining us today. We are going to be talking about key considerations for first-time federal applicants. It's going to be a dense, probably pretty bureaucratic discussion, and we're going to have a smaller group because we are sort of testing out an idea around some asynchronous training and some recordings and things like that. So I think most folks will be watching this as a recording. Couple of housekeeping notes for folks who are here in person today. You're muted upon entry, but you do have access to that chat box. So please add anything as we're going through. My colleague Rebecca is on and will be keeping an eye on that chat box for me. So if you have any questions as we're going through, please feel free. Also, it's going to be a small group, so if you want to, come off mute and ask a question, you should be able to do that too. And we are recording. So, like I said, we're going to post this online. Most folks, I think, are actually going to be watching the recording. One housekeeping thing about me, I live in southeastern Tennessee, and our pollen level today is critical. So I apologize if I'm coughing or sneezing as we're going through today. That's the burden of living in the southeast. So thank you for the grace there. Um, Quick schedule. We're going to talk really primarily about the objectives of federal funders and what they're going to ask you to do in return for giving you their money. So they're going to ask you, what do you spend money on? How do you make decisions about what you're spending? And how can you prove it was an eligible cost? We're going to be doing a lot of discussion about financials and records and a lot of that sort of stuff today. We'll have time for Q&A at the end if anybody online does have any questions, and then we'll share what's coming up in Lyft. So, like I said, we are really just going to talk in kind of very practical, objective terms about what happens when you get a federal grant. There's a couple of things to note here. It's going to be a very wordy presentation. I apologize for that in advance. We designed the slide deck to kind of be a resource. So think of today as a way to answer questions. We're not necessarily telling you what the answers are. We're telling you how to think about the answers and how to find the answers so that you can be ready and well prepared to manage these funds if and when you get more of them. That being said, there's going to be a couple of core principles, a couple of trade-offs, and a couple of practical insights that we share across each of these three questions that federal funders are going to be asking about. So, first question, what do you spend your money on? The core thing to know about all federal funding is that if it is not documented, it did not happen. Even if you did it perfectly and correctly, if you can't show that you did it, it doesn't actually matter. So it's really important to think about making sure you're writing everything down and keeping organized, consistent records about what you're doing with federal funding. That takes more time, right? One of the trade-offs for this, one of the negative consequences of getting federal dollars is that you need more staff capacity to be able to do record keeping, to show your internal controls, to have written policies and procedures, all of that fun documentation that comes along with federal funds. A simple way to think about how you should set this up is to think about what you need. And what this is going to do is really just be a built-in check and balance for you to make sure that your money is going out the door correctly. So there's a couple of things that are sort of the key practices for this. You're going to look at record keeping. So literally putting onto paper, digital paper, what you've done, keeping your invoices, keeping your payments that are going out. Your financial office will have detailed records of payments going in and coming out. You have to be able to show what documentation and what records are connected to which federal grants and which federal dollars. Part of this is done through the staff that you have and the responsibilities that those staff have, which leads you to separation of duties. There are things that you inherently have to separate upon receiving federal funding in order to show that there's no conflict of interest. So, like, you need to have supervisors sign off on employees' timesheets. It shouldn't just be the employees who were submitting those timesheets to you. You need that second set of eyes, and then you need to be able to show that you had that second set of eyes. And the key component of all of this is that this should be done consistently across all of your program activities, across all of your policies and procedures. They should sort of have the same general process for how this stuff gets like documented. One challenge that people have as they move into federal funding is that their other funds don't require this, and so they don't have as detailed processes, and they don't realize that they need to build it in order to get the federal dollars. So be thinking about that and how what other parts of your program might be impacted by this increased demand. One of the things that we are going to talk about is the great resources that Ojai has and has created. Excuse me, because their policies and procedures align with federal policies and procedures for the most part. Especially when we're talking about like federal dollars and the funds that Ojai gives you that are federal dollars. But again, if you adopt Ojai's policies and procedures for one program, you'll have to think about how that crosses over into your other programs and if that are you going to have two totally separate financial processes? Are you going to say you're doing the Ojai stuff, but actually just keep doing your regular sort of process? And you want to make sure that that's consistent. So, a positive trade-off with federal dollars is that they actually provide funding for this sort of administrative oversight. These are called indirect costs, and they are things that you can't necessarily attribute to one specific activity, right? A direct cost would be a salary. We know exactly where it's going, we know what it's for, we know that person's time. We might not know what percentage of the executive director salary is spent on a federal grant because it changes over time, or what uh, percentage of office supplies are specifically spent on each grant, right? So part of what you can do when you get federal dollars is take an indirect cost. And this just kind of explains indirect versus direct cost. There are three different ways that you can access indirect cost. You can have a federally negotiated indirect cost rate. This is a pretty complicated process. So if you're newer to federal funds, you probably don't have one of these. You have to directly negotiate an indirect cost rate with a representative federal organization, like HUD or like the Department of Education. A lot of universities will do this and they'll have 20-30% indirect rates approved through their NICRA with the Department of Education. If you aren't sure that you have one of these, you probably don't. In that case, you take what's called a de minimis rate, which is a standard 15% that's applied to what's called your modified total direct cost. This is a very complicated process, but essentially, not every type of activity in your grant is going to be eligible to be considered a part of this total direct cost. Capital expenses, for example, cannot be included in the MTDC when you're calculating that 15%. So you can't just take a standard 15% of every pay request that you submit and call that your indirect. It's a little more nuanced than that, but you don't have to have that approved. You don't have to get any approval from a federal organization or anything. You can take that rate as part of your federal costs. You can also do what's called a cost allocation plan, which is kind of like a combination of these two things, which is essentially just laying out how you're going to apply the indirect cost. And you have to do that when you're not using one of these two rates, but that is by far the least used option. And the vast, vast majority of people use either the NICRA or the de minimis rate. The way that you charge this is actually applying it to the direct cost in order to get a total line item. So if you have, to use Thor as an example, if you have emergency shelter funding and you have operations as one of the line items in your budget, you would take the direct cost of operations, so your supplies, your mileage, your rent for your office, and then you would apply the 15% indirect cost onto that direct cost. So if you had $100 of salaries, for example, in your operations cost, you would take 15% of that because salaries are part of the MTDC. You would take $15, you would actually charge $115 to the operations line item. I hope that makes sense. I wish I had a visual. I don't. I apologize. But Ojai does have some really helpful tools because this actually was just updated. It's a little easier, a little more flexible now, higher amounts as well. So we'll talk about that at the end. Um, just to check in, Rebecca, anything in the chat or anything that I should respond to?
Not so far.
Cool. Thanks. Okay, so the second question that federal funders are going to ask is how did you make the decisions that you made about your funding? So not only do they want to see what you have done, literally what you have paid for what service, to whom. They want to know how you make decisions about what you're going to do with the money. And I think the most important thing here that people might not expect is that the more documentation you have, it's not necessarily proving that you're doing things right. If you remember when I was saying that things have to be applied consistently, if your documentation says different things, that's a huge red flag. So you don't necessarily need to have 14 budgets. You need to have a correct budget and you need to know that that's the correct budget. But having a lot of different documents for your budget isn't going to help a budget auditor feel like you know what your budget is. So there's a couple of things that are just sort of general principles about how you make decisions about what you should do. The first is that things have to be reasonable. So it has, and this is one of the areas where federal regulation is interpretable, right? But it is a cost that a rational person would pay under a similar circumstance. How do you document that? You can be creative because if you have, like the example here, paying rent, you would need to show that it's not a luxury. You could show that it's not a luxury rent office. You could show that it is sort of within the average cost of other rent offices, things like that. But that's not a very clear principle. Just there has to be some rational explanation, some sort of logical explanation in the documents that you keep about why you're spending things the way that you are. It has to be allowable, so it has to be something that the grant allows for. In emergency shelter, you cannot pay someone's rent, right? That is not an allowable cost for an emergency shelter grant because emergency shelter is for folks who are in emergency shelter. Documented, we've talked about this. If it isn't documented, it didn't happen. But again, you have to show how it was incurred and how it was tied directly to that specific program or person. Allocable. So this isn't a weird one, maybe, but in order to show that something is allocable, you have to show that it is allocated to the grant. So this goes back to the direct cost idea. To use a staff salary as an example, if you have a position description and half of that position description is talking about supporting your emergency shelter work, and the other half of that program description is or project description is talking about the outreach supervisor or something. So you have one full-time employee who's going to be doing half shelter, half outreach. That's clearly designated in the position description. That allocates half of that person's salary to emergency shelter line and half of that person's salary to the outreach line. So you have to be able to show that connection in order to show the direct cost connected to the grant. If you have all of these things, it's reasonable, it's allowable, it's documented, and that documentation shows that it's allocable, then it can be reimbursable. So it has to meet all of the above criteria and whatever invoicing policies and procedures that you have to do in order to request a payment. And the cheesy acronym is RADAR. Reasonable, allocable, documented, reasonable, allowable, documented, allocable, reimbursable. One key thing to do as you're trying to figure out if you don't keep this type of documentation, it probably feels very nebulous and like vague and unclear. But one sort of test that you could run is just kind of thinking about an audit test. So if I were an auditor and I was looking at these documentation, records, and I didn't have any additional context, would I know what they spent money on, how they spent that money, and why they spent that money? If the answer to those questions are I don't know the answer, then you probably need more documentation in order to show your rationalization, your thought process for why you're spending money. One of the challenges about federal dollars and the fact that they're going to want to know all this information is that you have to do audits. So if you spend more than three-quarters of $1 million in a federal fiscal year, sorry, if you expend more than 750,000 in a federal grant in one fiscal year, that's your fiscal year. It doesn't have to be the federal fiscal year. That's whatever sort of year your organization does your accounting on. Within that year, if you spent more than $750,000 of federal funding, you automatically have to do a comprehensive single audit. That is the very robust audit. Bringing in a consultant to run the audit, they will give you a very standard template of what they are looking for. They will look at your programs. You have to post it online in order to continue to get federal funding. It's pretty arduous, I'm not going to lie. But there's a couple of things that you can do to make sure you're ready for it. So, as I've been saying the whole time, if it didn't get documented, it didn't happen. So, make sure you're keeping those records for at least 3 years after the grant closes. So, it's not 3 years from your award or the contract, it's after you're done with it. You have to keep it for at least 3 years. Sometimes it's even longer. So, make sure to check your grant agreement. During an audit, basically what's going to happen is that they're going to look at all of those records. They're going to ask you for case files. They might pull them randomly. They might tell you that you can generate them. There's a lot of different ways that it will happen, but you are going to have to show them all of the things that they want to see, and that has to be documented and recorded. The other thing about audits is that it often happens 2 or 3 years in advance, or like 2 or 3 years after the contract has ended. They generally are always coming back and sort of looking retroactively. So just something to think about as you're deciding how you want to approach federal funding. One thing that I think people may or may not know, but a lot of the grantees I worked with when I was at the Office of Homeless Initiatives, it felt kind of like the end of the world for a finding to happen. And basically, what happens in an audit is they say either you are meeting all of the principles and everything is good, or they say, actually, we found this issue. But they'll always give you a corrective action plan. They'll give you a specific resolution, a specific way to resolve the issue. And so same thing with like program monitoring. When you get federal funding and they come and look at like specifically your program documents, and audit sort of looks at your financial documents. The monitoring will look at both your financial but your program documents as well. They'll tell you what it is and they'll give you a chance to fix it. So it's not like if something is found, you have to pay all of the money back and all these things. They'll give you a chance to fix it, but you do have to fix it. So just something to be thinking about. There are other ways. If you don't spend $750,000 in a federal year, you don't have to do a single audit. You probably should be doing other sorts of audits. But there are also lighter touch reviews, which are just sort of like desk reviews where people will just send like high level documentation and they'll look at it that way. Um, Generally, the audits will also focus on one program. So it's not necessarily your whole entire organization, unless your whole entire organization is funded by the program. But they'll be looking at like very specific parts. They're not going to look at, every case file of a rapid rehousing program, for example, to use HUD as the example, but they will ask you for some of those case files and they will expect the case file to have all of the documentation in it. So the unfortunate thing is that even though sometimes you don't have to do with robust audits and monitorings, you still have to keep the same level of documentation because the logic there is that if these case files have it, it's much more likely that all the other case files have it as well. If these case files don't have it, they might often give you a deeper audit or monitoring. Okay, so how did you know it was eligible? So this is a question that I think kind of trips people up a lot because there's not really a specifically clear answer across all federal regulation. Like the regs are not going to be able to answer every single very specific situation that's going to happen between, Yuma and Durango, right? Like there's just so many different situations. So part of what we want to make sure to talk about is how do you find the answers to your questions and then be able to justify that in the face of an audit or a monitoring. The trade-off around definition of eligibility is kind of neutral. Federal funding comes with a really high level of sort of definition around what is eligible. So that's helpful because it makes it, in most situations, pretty clear what you can and cannot do. So that's helpful, but it's also kind of restricting and limiting. And it is really hard sometimes to spend federal funds. A common example in Colorado is that housing vouchers have to adhere to fair market rents. And there's a lot of communities in Colorado where you cannot find a unit for rent at what HUD says is the max that you can pay to rent. The housing costs are much more expensive. So it's kind of a neutral trade-off. Um, Again, a lot of words. This is meant to be a resource. The high level overview, the too long didn't read of these words is basically there's a couple of go-to steps that you can sort of walk through when you're trying to find answers to whether or not something is eligible. So the first thing is that you have to go back to your contract or your award with the funder directly. Even if the federal funds come from or even if Ojai's funds come from somewhere else originally, you would still look at your contract with Ojai to use an example like that. Whoever is giving you the money is what contract you're going to look at first, because that often defines either what you can and cannot do or where you can go to find what you can and cannot do, right? They might reference their federal award or they might put it directly in the contract that they have with you. If it's not in that contract, then you would generally go to something like 2 CFR 200. So that's the legal structure for the Code of Federal Regulation. And it's the program specific rules or guidance about how to do sort of all federal funds. Like any dollars that come from the government have to adhere to 2 CFR 200, um, as well as the other program requirements that different agencies or states or local governments put onto them. So 2 CFR is sort of like the first place to start, right? If it's answered there, it will not be answered somewhere else because you can't really conflict with the 2 CFR except for to sort of further restrict or refine, if that makes sense. Um, if you still have uncertainty, then you can ask sort of the initial funder for that written clarification. But I would, a piece of advice that I often give people is only going to the funder when you feel like you have your answer and you want verification of that, right? Don't go to them and say, "What do you think about this situation?" Because whatever they say is then what you have to do. Um, Instead, you can sort of walk through these first two steps and find the answer that you think is correct, and then have them verify that if you are not sure of it. So it's not, hey, can I we need to use hotel vouchers. Um, can we move some money? Or I don't know. I'm trying to think of something that's not about moving a budget. Hey, we have somebody who we are going to house them, but they need X, Y, or Z documentation, and our policies allow for X, Y, or Z documentation. What should I do? They're going to give you the most robust list of documents. They're going to want everything recorded. They're probably going to err on the side of risk avoidance, which is their job, and that makes sense. Whereas if you can come to them and you can say, hey, in 2 CFR 200, it says that we are allowed to spend these types of costs in this way. The program policy further justifies that. Da, 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 da. Do you agree? You're going to get a very different answer. So find what you need, learn how to get the answers out of the regulation, and structure them in a way and structure them in a way that allows you to get the outcome that you want. That sounds like I'm telling you to manipulate the federal funds. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is understand where it's interpretable, right? There's gray area throughout this. Let's go back to what a prudent person would spend, right? There's a lot of sort of area for interpretation. So it's up to us to know where that is and use that to our advantage as opposed to being limited by it because we are trying to help people who have a lot of need and have a lot of unique situations. And so being able to understand where you can interpret that federal regulation, staying within the letter of the law, making sure you know the context of what you're doing, but making rational decisions to help people as opposed to hurt people, which is what a lot of people have interpreted policies as in the past. Okay. Um, One interesting thing about federal funding, your application is going to talk about target populations and outcomes that you want to see and things like that. Your actual grant compliance is going to be much more focused on ensuring that the people that you served were eligible. So you can have this idea of target populations of single mothers, living in certain areas. But if you serve someone who is not eligible for the contract that you are being funded for, it doesn't matter what your target population was. The federal funders are going to look at the eligibility documentation and making sure that you serve people who are eligible for the grant. So that might seem like kind of a different side of the same coin, and it is, but it's a really important difference when you think about how to set up your programs. If you are trying to focus on target populations that don't fundamentally align with the eligible population of the grant that you are applying for, that might not be a great match because you aren't going to be able to fit that square peg into the federal circle. What you are going to have to do is change your program to make sure that you are only spending dollars on eligible populations, regardless of what your mission statement is, regardless of what your, intent for the grant was. It's about the eligibility piece. So this is a quick sort of exercise about what is going to be in each of the regulations and what are sort of your go-to places to look at. So for this, we actually start, excuse me for 1 second. We actually start at that 2 CFR 200, which is the uniform guidance for all federal funding. So the high level questions that this answers are, um, can this type of costs be charged to federal funds, period, at all? What kinds of things make program charges allowable, allocable, and supported? What are you going to be what do you want to see defined in audits and things like that? So it's going to be very high level financial documentation. Um, do you do cash accrual versus or cash or accrual accounting? Do you do, um, time and activity tracking in your personnel files, that sort of stuff? That is layered onto with program regulations. That's where you get into like, okay, what are you doing? Is this type of activity eligible? Are the services inside or outside of the scope of the intent of the program? So 2CFR is kind of how you're spending the money. Program regs are what are you spending the money on? Funder policies. This one is important because it's not just about what the funder wants, but it's about what you have agreed to. So what's in your budget is also sort of protective of you and your work. One thing that you will want to think about as you're thinking about how your budget or how regulations impact your program is how regulations dictate when you need approval to charge a cost or change a cost. Because again, this all comes down to money and you're spending money on the things that you need. So you might need to change that money around. Um, Sort of at the lowest tier here are your organizational policies and procedures. For smaller organizations who are just getting into federal funding, that might sound backwards, but it's not, unfortunately. If you take federal funds, you're sort of agreeing to putting all of their rules and expectations ahead of your own, if there's disagreement. So you can't not do part of these things if you have federal dollars just because that's, not how your organization does it. Unfortunately, that's not sufficient. So again, be thinking about how accepting or taking federal funds might change other programs. To make this concrete, we have given a case study. So we're going to be talking about emergency shelter overnight staff and their salaries here. So, um, oh no. Oh shoot. Interesting. Sorry, Rebecca, can you still hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. And
Hmm.
I can see you moving the slides. It looks like maybe something just didn't open.
Yeah, it just sort of popped out. Can you see the case studies?
No, we're on the original slide with like the two CFR and so on.
Okay. Sorry, folks. Okay. Do you see the case studies coming on now?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Sorry, guys. I have no idea what that was. Okay. We're going to be talking about emergency shelter overnight staff. So let's say you are starting an emergency shelter and you want to know whether or not you can pay certain types of staffing positions. So in the 2CFR 200, the uniform guidance, you're going to find how to document the dollars that are going to pay staff salary. So it's not going to tell you if the work is eligible or not. It's not going to tell you what level of background the person needs to have or anything like that. It's going to tell you the logistics of how you pay that person. So it's going to tell you that you need timesheets and you're going to need to track the actual work performed. It's going to tell you how to process payroll and what levels of approval you have to have into, if you remember, separations of duties. It's going to sort of lay out what are the duties that have to be included in some of these types of payroll and budget processes, that sort of stuff. Then you can go to the program regulations to define allowable staff roles. So you know how you're going to pay them, but what can they do? What can you pay them for? So this is going to be things like this is going to tell you whether or not emergency shelter staff is something that you can pay for with this program. It's going to tell you, does it have to be case management? Can you do operations? These are some of the things that you can be lenient around if you put your own organizational sort of language to the side for just a second. So, for example, one thing in emergency shelter, let's use ESG for an example. ESG has something called services and something called operations. So when you are setting up your program, it's helpful to understand that level of detail about how the budget is set up because that might change how you hire a person. Um, if you know, for example, that if I have a position description that has half case management, half operations overnight, then you can charge those line items to the correct amount and you don't have to keep the time tracking in the same way that you do if it's, as needed emergency shelter, as needed street outreach, because you will have to charge the actual time for what a person worked. So you can set up your internal operations to sort of align with the federal expectations, and it makes the administration of that a little bit easier. So, all of that to say, while these two things might sound very different and feel very distinct, they do also align, and there are ways that you can set your program up for success if you have an understanding of what the requirement for documentation is going to be on the federal side. So as you look at your awards, your grants, your contracts, your subcontracts, whatever you call them, the legal document that gives you the money from the funder, that's going to include things like very specific line items, funding caps if they exist, 10% on admin or ceilings for salaries and things like that. It's going to tell you how you can invoice and where you need to send those invoices and what sorts of approvals you need to have in order to change the specific scope that you have, et cetera. So it's going to take both the 2CFR and the program regulations and really even further refine what you can do with the specific grant. Um, and then again, your organizational procedures will define how you do all of the things that the federal regulations are asking you to do. Um, so, the federal regulations will explain how you need to process payroll. Generally, you need to have two levels of review. You need to define whether you're doing cash or accrual accounting, et cetera. Your organizational policies, you're going to say, our finance director, collects timesheets from supervisors who review and sign on the 4th of every month or whatever it is. Um, and the trick here is how do you document all this without having too much documentation? Again, because once it starts to contradict, it is not necessarily beneficial for your administration of the grant or audits or things like that. So it's a fine line for sure. It's a balance. I think I've said this before, but there's not like a specific yes or no to every question. The funder, the auditor, the monitor, they're going to come in and they're going to want to know how you made those decisions. So as long as you have a justifiable, like rational, this is eligible, and here's how I know it's eligible, and here's how I know I spent these dollars on something that was eligible. As long as you can show that, um, it's really important toward the long-term success of the program. The one thing too that I don't think people think about is this third question here is, did we agree to it? Um, is the funder asking me to send them documentation around homelessness prevention when they didn't give us money for homelessness prevention, right? Like that's an absurd example and hopefully won't happen to you, but just to give you a specific example there. Um, So part of the trade-off for federal funding is that, once you get an audit, if there is a finding, like I said, you have a chance to correct it. If you don't correct it, there are consequences. You might be out of compliance. You might not be able to get future funding. You might have to pay it back. There are a lot of sort of recapture techniques that can happen. And so it is important to consider like the potential consequence. Does this happen often? Not in my experience, right? People, the federal government knows that federal grants are hard, and they will give you a chance and support to correct it. But if you don't, you then do have to send funds back, and you also lose the ability to apply for federal funds in the future. Excuse me. The terminology is being suspended or debarred. If you have applied to Ojai, you've probably gotten your, I think they're no longer called unique identity numbers, but your specific SAM.gov verification that says, yes, this organization can get federal funds. If you don't have that, if you have a federal grant and you mismanagement, you might lose that and be unable to get all federal funding in the future, not just from, HUD or Department of Education, any sort of federal funding. So sometimes this can happen for very simple things. So not maintaining your SAM.gov, having weak systems. And there are some very specific things that you can do to address that. But it is another sort of layer of administration that you have to think about and remember and do somewhat frequently. I do think the system is pretty user friendly, but um, just to call that out. One other thing, just to note that even if you don't get money directly from HUD, let's use Thor as an example. If you don't have a contract with the Treasury, which is the organization that is giving out the dollars for ARPA, which is what Thor is funded through. Sorry to use so many acronyms. Um, the Transformational Homeless Response Grant, which was funded by the American Rescue Plan, are federal funds, but they are given to folks through the state agency. There is a potential that even though you don't have a direct contract with the federal grantor, you might still be monitored. HUD is very accustomed to asking for end user files. They will, especially for like housing programs and things, they'll do rapid rehousing verification checks. They'll make sure you're doing the case management notes. They'll make sure you're doing the ongoing reevaluations. Like they will ask, to use this example, they'll ask Ojai for those client files, and then Ojai will come and ask you. So just to note that even if you don't have that direct contract, you still have to follow the expectations. Okay. In light of that, I will stop and see, Rebecca, any questions, anything coming up? I'm gonna do a walkthrough here.
Nothing in the chat yet.
Okay. So I'm gonna stop this. Okay. Oh, sorry. So one thing that Ojai does pretty regularly is sharing their resources. A lot of the money that Ojai gets comes from the federal government, and so they are required to, oh shoot, folks, sorry, my computer, there we go. They require folks to okay, well, we're going to share my desktop and you will just see how many tabs I have open. So I apologize for that. Um, Because a lot of the funds for Ojai come from the federal government, they have a lot of really great resources around how to administer their funding. So, this is one of those resources that is for, again, the transformational homeless response grants. But a lot of these apply to one, a lot of the folks who are going to be watching this recording, as well as um, a lot of the like a lot of the other programs that Ojai has. So, this document is their program comparison model. This would be akin to, if we come back to this chart here. Rebecca, can you see the slide deck now?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So this is going to be akin to something like this, or something like this, the funder policies, if that's in your contract specifically. But this is where Ojai says, okay, we know what 2 CFR says we have to do. Beyond that, this is how we're defining our program models. So this is sort of layered on top of those basic 2 CFR 200 requirements, just to put some context there. This document, and we're going to have all of these links in the PowerPoint that we share, but this document is the uniform guidance rule change. So, as I mentioned before, you have direct costs and indirect costs. The rule around indirect costs changed recently, and it allowed you to go from 10% de minimis rate to 15% de minimis rate. So, there's some other changes in there as well that get pretty nitty-gritty. But that's one document that if you are thinking about taking federal funds and you really want to recoup those indirect costs, be very familiar with this document. A couple of other really helpful documents in here are these pay request documents. Again, this is going to be really specific to Ojai's specific expectations, but it is going to tell you a lot of things about what are those allowable costs? If you remember, reasonable, allowable, documented, allocable, reimbursable, this is where you define allowable costs. They have the same type of overview around indirect costs. This is where it talks about that reimbursement rate. So again, this is going to be something that's part of your contract with the funder. And so it's going to be part of that award, that grant award, one of those first places that you look when you're trying to answer questions about whether or not you can even pay for something. So they've got all these resources here that talk you through the specifics of some of the stuff that we were just talking about. Um, Monitoring is a good one to do if you're thinking about like how to prepare for an audit, right? Auditing and monitoring are similar but different. But a lot of these resources that Ojai has put out help know what types of things you need to keep, what kinds of questions you need to answer, whether or not you can answer those questions and show where that came from more or less. Um, it's helpful exercises to think about again if you're considering like what is it actually going to take to start applying for federal grants and managing them well. Looking at how much of this sort of stuff you should be able to answer about that program will help you know what sort of level of staffing, training, administration, et cetera, you might need. And then same thing with some basic record retention. So this is a lot. It's a lot to think about. It's a lot to remember. No one knows all of this stuff just in their mind, right? It is the key here is how do you start to be able to find those answers? How do you start to understand where the documents live, where the rules live, what parts of them are firm and what parts of them have, reasonable logic around them? How do we use that to help the people that we are trying to serve, right? I think that's the key thing that I would like folks to go away from today with is it's about how do you understand all of this well enough to get that great, large, meaningful federal grant to the community members that you serve. And is that trade-off worth it, right? Is focusing on all of this documentation and record keeping and invoicing and all of that worth the time it takes away from maybe being able to serve people? I think those are all really important questions. Okay. I don't think we have anything in the chat, but Rebecca, just triple checking that.
Nope, not
Okay.
yet.
All right. So I'm actually going to stop sharing. We do have a couple of things coming up. While I tell you what's coming up, Just a quick poll. We love to do polls. Thank you for always doing our polls. You do get a chance to win a $5 gift card if you fill out our poll. While you are doing that,
And Cassie, this might just be me, but I saw the poll pop up and then it disappeared. Do,
ah,
does anyone else have that issue, or maybe not?
one moment. It does say, there we go. How's that, Rebecca?
I've got it, and I saw the same from Erica, so hopefully you can see it now, Erica too, and others. Got it. Perfect.
Cool. And can you see the slideshow?
Yes.
Thanks. Okay. So this is our website. We have our upcoming resources listed there. We have two more program excellence components that are coming up. We are going to be doing a sort of debrief on HMIS, what functionalities Colorado HMIS has, what types of support reports, canned reports, customized reports are built into the system that folks can and should be using for meaningful real-time program improvement. That's going to be in 2 weeks. And then 2 weeks after that, we're going to have a learning circle with a panel of experts around rapid rehousing. Then we're going to move into what we're calling intentional inputs. We're going to maybe test out some asynchronous learning where we pre-record some of the stuff and send it out to folks, and then work through tools that are developed from the um, sort of core content. We really want to be intentional, no pun intended, with our intentional input section, and want it to be community specific, really meaningfully shaped by the local situations that are happening, sort of in where that the program is happening in. So we're really excited about that, and yeah, I think that is the last thing from our end. Rebecca, anything you want to add or anything um, that you want to share before we hop off today?
No, that was a fantastic overview and hopefully gives folks a lot of food for thought. And just, I want to emphasize something you said. Nobody knows all of this. It's knowing where to go to get the information and just kind of going back to your source materials, asking the right person the right questions to get approval for things, and documenting. So it's easy and not easy at the same time.
I have a quick question, if that's okay.
Of course.
So,
Yeah, actually, go ahead. Yeah.
okay. In regards to some of these higher level federal resources, right, the Code of Federal Regulations, what, if any, follow-up resources or maybe overview materials might exist to become more familiar with them?
And just in terms of like what is even in there and how do you.
Yeah, well, I mean, we cited some pretty specific ones.
Mhm.
2 CFR 200 for financial regulations, and then also like the program specific CFR sections. I'm wondering if there are like just interpretations or that knowledge distilled outside of just reading through those websites and those materials, or if it is really just a matter of finding it with a Command F or Control F in that way.
So there, let me do this. My honest answer to you is like a Google search or like an AI search of like where can I find whatever your specific question is, because there is so much. That being said, and Chelsea, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but Chelsea and I have spent a lot of time in the CFR, and I'm really curious if you agree with this or not. But like I found, Seamus, very specifically, there's a lot of different websites that have digitized the CFR. That have different functionalities. And some of them are like the search functions, or like some of them click and connect to different parts. And there's different ways that you can kind of familiarize yourself with it. So my first piece of advice is find the one that you that's most user friendly to you. My second piece of advice is if you know somebody who knows this stuff, ask them how they find it. Like ask them how they would answer the question, not what the answer to the question is, but like where they are thinking about where to find it, because it's more about understanding how to move through it than reading it. But at the end of the day, like it does require a little bit of just slogging through it, unfortunately. Um, Again, Chelsea, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm curious if you would agree with that and if you have anything else.
Yeah, I think I agree. And then I think too, it's like it feels very abstract when you don't have a specific question in front of you. When you do have a specific question, it does make it easier to search. I also think it depends on kind of where you are in your grant cycle. So if you are completely unfamiliar with programs and really just trying to start with, okay, what's the specific program I could even look for? SAM.gov has what's called assistance listings, which I'll put in the chat, and you could search a particular topic, like you might search homelessness, and it will tell you what federal programs support that topic. So let me put that in the chat. That can be a good spot to at least narrow down, okay, what are some programs that I'm interested in? And then to Cassie's point about regulations, it's like you could literally Google that program regulations and it'll take you to those regulations. The other resource that I really love that I think helps navigate the regulations a little bit are what's called, at least for HUD programs, HUD has monitoring exhibits. Unfortunately, I do not think are posted on the website anymore because the HUD website has changed a lot the last year or so. But if you were to Google HUD monitoring exhibits, you might find some, and those will take a particular topic and it's literally like a checklist. Like it will be like HUD Emergency Solutions Grant Program Financial Management Exhibit. And it's a checklist for you that basically says, okay, based on the regulations that cover financial management, here is exactly what you should have. Like, do you have a policy about this? Does your participant file have this document in it? So, SAM.gov, HUD monitoring exhibits, if you can find them archived online or if they ever come to the HUD website again.
Does Ojai still have the ones we made, Chelsea?
We Yes, I mean, we have the ones we completed, and so we could go back through very easily and just remove the content and
Yeah,
share those.
just a
I,
thought.
yeah, yeah, that's a good.
The other thing, Seamus, that's helpful. So this is my preferred. This is the one that I like to use, but use whichever one you want. But just to sort of show, so the general organization, you've got acronyms and definitions, right? But then the rest of these sections here, this is the main sort of chunk of what it is, and it's organized by the life cycle of the grant. So you have general for provisions, which is sort of like this is not time limited. This is just sort of generally like how we do money. This is what happens before the federal grant happens. So this is going to be stuff like, oops, hold on one second. This is going to be stuff like, how do you plan, how can you plan to spend the money? How do you, um, like prepare to get the money? Is there notification that you have to do pre-award costs, as in like when can the grant, like when can the spending start, stuff like that. Post federal award is what happens immediately after the grant agreement is signed. So this isn't post the grant term. This is like, okay, January 1st, 2026, my contract starts today. What do I need to be thinking about? So that's going to have stuff like what do you have to do before you spend money? Like, what do you know? What documentation do you know you need to connect? What roles do you need to have assigned? What does cost sharing mean? How do I, if my program gets income, what do I do with it? It's sort of like setting you up for success. Cost principles, this is going to be a lot of this. You see reasonable, allocable, like this is where like the rationale for your eligibility discussions kind of lives. This one's not as time sensitive. It is kind of throughout. And then audit requirements is once it's done, what do you have to be able to show, how, when, where, all that sort of stuff. So that's helpful in terms of like that's sort of how it's organized.
That's
And then
really, really, really helpful. I'm sorry I cut you off,
no,
but
it's
I
good.
wanted to ask and clarify these specific regulations you're walking through apply to all federal funded grants, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Thanks. That's very helpful.
I'm
Cassie,
glad.
Cassie, do we have time for me to just build
Yeah.
on what you're saying? So, similar to what Cassie is showing here, that applies to all federal grants. Like Cassie said, I mean, each program has its own regulations as well. And so, when you do have a specific program in front of you, like Cassie, yeah, will you search, yeah, 576 or ESG? Um, so if you were like, okay, I have ESG money, I think I want to pay for security deposits, but I don't know if that's allowed. You could literally control F security deposit. We might need to be five. Let's go to Can you go to the view full text version, Cassie, up to the right? Yeah. So now control F security deposit. Keep going. So you'll find, okay, yes, if I have so housing relocation and stabilization, that is part of this component or part of supportive services, you'll know like, okay, yes, I can pay for security deposits, but I have to make sure that it is no more than 2 months rent. So there's questions like that in front of you that can be helpful. And then another thing that is helpful when it comes to those regulations that apply to all of the federal grants. OHI is currently working on, where is it? I have way too many tabs open. OHI has a internal wellness checklist that they adapted from HUD. It's specifically for the COC PSH program, but it really covers a lot of that 2 CFR Part 200. So I'll screen share it really fast so you can see what it looks like. And then Cassie, I can send this to you as well afterwards so you all can send it out. You just had it open.
While you're doing that, I just to very concretely answer your question, Seamus, of like at some point you just have to kind of become familiar with this. I don't know if you caught it or not because she did it so quickly, but she called out the specific CFR 576 dot whatever, whatever. Like that, like unfortunately, that's sometimes how familiar you have to get with it. And it is just kind of sitting down and reading it. So
And you will get familiar with it as you work on more grants. But this is a good example of if you were to Google, like policies and procedures for COC or ESG, you'd probably find a document like this from HUD. At DOH and OHI, we've just adapted it to be DOH branded, but it again is just a checklist of, okay, what are some things I need for general record keeping? Well, because of this regulation, again, this is for a COC program, but it would apply to others. Like you need to make sure you saved your grant agreement. You need to make sure you've saved any amendments. You need to make sure you've saved your agreements if you have your own grantees. So I'll send a checklist like this to Cassie and they can send it out. But this is the type of stuff you'll find when you Google.
Thank you guys very much. Really appreciate it.
And Cassie, we've got a question in the chat from Cullen.
Okay, I will read it because I think the recording has the chat, but the biggest challenges that we've seen with new organizations receiving federal funding, most common challenges that people should think about. I think, Colin, it's just not knowing what the expectation was at the beginning and then having to clean it up post haste. Or after the fact, Seamus, it seems like maybe you're nodding from experience. So I think yeah. That's a good question, but it's really, unfortunately, it's just that they haven't spent hours sitting with the Code of Federal Regulations, and not everybody has time or capacity to do that. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what you touched on would probably be really useful as like a starting point for folks. But that's just one thing I've considered is in these circumstances, right? You chase the opportunity, you try and seize the momentum if it's there and available, right? But it's kind of like a question for me of like, how can organizations sort of on the front end more seriously evaluate whether they do have that capacity to catch up? or kind of make more strategic decisions. Because particularly in this world, right, federal funding isn't the only ball game in town when it comes to funding this work. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's just something I've been considering over the course of the last year
Yeah.
plus.
I think in the same way that we do program site visits, I think we should start to do like administration site visits. And what I mean by that is like I would recommend that if you're thinking about doing federal funding and you've never done it before, sit down with somebody who has the grant or sit down with somebody who has a similar grant. Um, the trick there is they might not be doing it well and they might point you in the wrong direction. But if they show you anything other than a buttload of documentation that is monotonous and confusing, they're probably not doing it right. So get someone who knows, who you can sort of do the sniff test of like, is this as much as I expect? If not, maybe find somebody else. But really look at what they do, how much staff time it takes, all of the different types of documentation, or the resource that Chelsea shared, like go through that checklist, like do the self-assessments. I wish more people looked at the monitoring expectation before they applied or looked at the monitoring expectation when they decided what to apply for or how they were going to set up the program. Because there have been many times where you kind of look backwards and you're like, well, if I had known that, I would have done this very differently. And like you can know that, but you just have to do it in advance. So, yeah, cool. Okay, well, we've done survey. Any other questions that are coming up for folks? Otherwise, I'm happy to give people 25 minutes back in their day. We will send out the recording. We will send out all these resources. And myself, Colin, and Rebecca are around to talk about any sort of federal questions that folks have, especially folks who are on the recording. Um, I'm going to stop that now. I think I'm so bad at Zoom. There it is. Great.